Emerging from my room with a smug grin on her face was Sherry, my son's wife. "Oh, thank you," I replied. I had just cleaned my room a few days ago, but maybe it still looked messy to someone else. I decided to just thank her for now. Sherry never lifts a finger around the house. She's always snarky and throws tantrums when things don't go her way, so her cleaning my room, that's suspicious to say the least. "I don't know what you're up to, but it won't work," I muttered quietly, making sure Sherry, who was watching TV at high volume, couldn't hear me. Then I went back to my chores. I've put up with a lot from her, and my patience is wearing thin. I've warned her before, but if she continues to act this way, she'll have to face the consequences. My name is Lara, and I'm 73 years old. I met my husband, Frank, at a social event. We were both shy at first, but now we enjoy our evening coffee chats. After we got married, I became pregnant with our son, George. Frank was thrilled and helped me with chores, even though he was clumsy. Once George moved out for work, our lively home became quiet and we felt a bit lonely. Then George brought home Sherry, his then girlfriend. Frank and I thought she was beautiful and well-mannered. Sherry looked dazzling as she sat on the sofa, her long black hair tied up and her back straight. My husband and I talked a lot with Sherry, leaving George alone because he was too nervous to understand what he was saying. We liked her so much that we encouraged George to marry her quickly, which they did. Life got busy again with their honeymoon and moving to a new place, but we enjoyed it. We were disappointed when they decided not to have children, but we understood. We thought peaceful days were ahead, but we were wrong. They kept coming back home for trivial reasons, whether it was a broken air conditioner in the summer or unpaid electric bills in the winter. They'd stay with us but leave all the work to us. At first, we felt sorry for them, but it became increasingly annoying. Frank, who once welcomed them warmly, now gets stressed just seeing them. As for George, he's as oblivious as ever, acting like he can do whatever he wants. My son and daughter-in-law decided to come visit us out of the blue. George called me last week and said, "Hey Mom, we're coming over next week, just a heads up." Then he went radio silent, leaving me in the dark about when exactly they'd arrive. Then, just as suddenly, I got a message from Sherry saying, "We'll be there soon, so get ready." I had to scramble to prepare everything. Frank said, "You handle the bedding and clothes, I'll go buy the groceries we're missing. If you could jot down a shopping list, that'd be great." Then he went to change. I thanked him and quickly wrote down the ingredients for tonight's dinner, placing the note on the living room table. Then I started airing up the guest futon. When I returned to the living room, Frank was looking at the note. "Is this everything? If you remember anything else, just text me and I'll pick it up," he said with a smile. I couldn't help but smile back. Just as I was about to get the clothes, I heard a loud voice from the entrance. "Lara, are you there?" Sherry was calling out to me from the front door without even ringing the doorbell. I rushed to open it. "Come on, you knew we were coming. Why did you leave the door open?" Sherry complained as she walked in. Her eyebrows instantly wrinkled in annoyance. "What's the matter? It's rude not to be happy when someone comes to visit," she retorted. I held my tongue and welcomed her in. "Where's George?" I asked, noticing his absence. "Oh, Frank snagged him for grocery shopping," she replied nonchalantly. I was a bit annoyed by her attitude but decided to let it go and continued with my preparations. Sherry didn't lift a finger to help. She just sat there eating her snacks and occasionally laughing at the TV. After a while, she suddenly stood up and left the living room. I assumed she went to the bathroom and didn't think much of it, but when she returned, she looked pleased. "Lara, your room was a mess, so I cleaned it up for you," she announced. I was taken aback. She had gone into my room without asking. I had questions but decided to thank her anyway. She grinned and plopped back down on the sofa. Just then, Frank and George returned. I had asked Frank to buy quite a lot, knowing that the young couple would be staying for a few days. Frank had apparently enlisted George as his pack mule, and it looked like he had accomplished his mission. Frank handed me the groceries, stepping over a visibly exhausted George, who was still holding bags at the entrance. After saying thanks, I took out what I needed and started putting the rest away in the fridge. "Hey George, stop lounging and bring everything here," Frank called out. George, still sitting by the entrance, looked a bit annoyed but eventually brought in all the bags in a few trips. "Man, I'm beat. Mom, pour me some iced coffee too," George said. "Do it yourself," Frank scolded George again for his whiny tone, but I prepared the coffee with a smile. "Welcome back, thank you. Dinner will be ready soon, so just wait a bit." All right, George said as he took the iced coffee and headed to the living room. He sat next to Sherry and gulped down his drink. I continued preparing dinner, but Sherry didn't offer to help. Not that I expected her to. In fact, I'd rather she didn't. She might mess something up. Eventually, dinner was ready and we all ate. It was a simple spaghetti meal, but there were no complaints from George or Sherry, so it was all good. After dinner, the room had that relaxed post-meal atmosphere. Frank and the young couple were watching TV, no conversation, but that's better than the alternative. I left the living room to get their change of clothes. On my way, I ran into Frank, who had just come out of the shower. Should I offer George the shower first? I can go last, he suggested. Oh, you've been out shopping. I can't make you wait, I replied, laughing as I entered the living room to find George dozing off. George, don't sleep here. Go take a shower. Stop nagging, George replied listlessly. I placed his change of clothes on him and handed Sherry hers. Sherry took the clothes but quickly pushed them back with a frown. I like the ones I wore before. These aren't as nice, she complained. I was taken aback by Sherry's complaint, but arguing would only escalate things. Oh, is that so? Wait a moment, I said, heading to look for the other clothes. George, uninterested in the whole affair, yawned and headed to the shower. While searching, Frank popped his head in. Do you know where my golf balls are? Aren't they next to the closet where you usually hang your coat and bag? I can't find them, he replied. Puzzled, I watched Frank leave and then returned to Sherry with the new clothes. Ah, this is it. You get what you pay for, she said, satisfied with the replacement. I had bought the clothes when Sherry and I went shopping, specifically for when they stayed over. Sherry had insisted on something expensive, and I had given in. I'll shower next. I don't want to go after an old person, Sherry said, just as I was about to retort. Frank returned, looking concerned. Still can't find them. Sherry, do you know where the bag of golf balls next to the coat closet is? Frank, seemingly at a loss after searching everywhere, decided to ask around, not expecting much of an answer. What he got was a shock. I have no idea what you're talking about. Are you accusing me of stealing? That's terrible. How could you suspect me? Sherry's loud denial left me stunned. Frank tried to explain it was a misunderstanding, but an irate Sherry wouldn't hear it. George, freshly showered, returned, and we all tried to calm her down, but she stormed off to the shower room, still in a bad mood. The living room fell silent, filled with tension. What just happened? George asked, noting that it was rare for Sherry to be this flustered. But why did she really get so angry? I couldn't help but suspect Sherry based on her usual behavior. Come on, Dad, apologize. You're practically accusing her, George said. Before I knew it, George and Frank were arguing. It took me quite a while to break it up. Just then, Sherry returned from her shower, making things even more complicated. Now Frank was the one being grilled by the young couple, but Frank didn't back down, especially when he scolded Sherry for her behavior today. She stormed off to the guest room. George continued to yell, blocking Frank, who tried to follow her. You keep blaming Sherry, but you haven't apologized for suspecting her. You never apologize. That's what I hate about you. Enough, Frank muttered. Do as you please, and he returned to his room. The living room fell silent again. I sighed and headed for the shower. I'm going to bed, George said curtly, heading for the guest room. I stopped him. The guest feed and smells musty, George. Sleep in my room. Sherry's overreaction to Frank's words and the mysterious cleaning of my room had made me suspicious. I decided to let George use my room, which was originally intended for Sherry. Your room? I'm fine with a little mustiness. I'm not a kid anymore, George protested. What if you get pneumonia? See, that's what I mean. Fine, I get it, George replied. Annoyed but giving in, he headed to my room while I glanced at the guest room Sherry was using. She wouldn't know about this exchange, being in a bad mood. If nothing was wrong, that was fine. I planned to prepare the guest room for George tomorrow. George opened the door to my room and went in. Whoa, what they? I heard George scream and rushed to my room, flinging open the half-closed door. I turned on the light and was speechless. George was in the room, clutching his leg in pain, surrounded by a scattering of golf balls. The golf balls Frank had been looking for were strewn all over my room. In the pitch-black room, George must have stepped on them. Of course he did. Who would ever think there'd be golf balls scattered all over the room? George lost his balance, stepping on one, and tried to regain it, but ended up putting his weight in the wrong place and fell hard. He was clutching his leg and whimpering, tears streaming down his face. Hearing the commotion, both Frank and Sherry came out of their rooms. Frank peered into the room from behind me and said, "What's going on here?" He tried to help George up, but also tripped on a golf ball and almost fell, just like George. I turned around. There stood Sherry, pale as a ghost and trembling. Why is this happening? This is Lara's room." Her voice was so soft it was almost drowned out by Frank's urgent questioning of George. "Yes, this is my room. Speaking of which, Sherry, you cleaned this room today, didn't you?" At my words, Frank and George turned to look at her. Sherry took a step back, flustered. "Did you see these golf balls when you cleaned?" I asked gently. Sherry just stood there, shaking. "Sherry, do you know anything about these golf balls?" Still, Sherry remained silent. "Hey, Sherry, what's going on? Answer me," George demanded, his patience wearing thin despite his obvious pain. I didn't know you'd be coming into this room," Sherry finally said, backing away and shaking her head. Frank muttered, "We have no choice but to call an ambulance and the police." At those words, Sherry collapsed on the spot, sobbing. I immediately called an ambulance and the police, then checked on George. He was sitting, clutching his leg, struggling to breathe, his face red with anger. He answered my questions, but his eyes were filled with rage toward Sherry. Eventually, the ambulance arrived, and I accompanied George to the hospital. After an examination, it was determined that George had fractured the top of his foot and would need to be hospitalized. By the time we got to the hospital, his foot was swollen and bruised, almost too painful to look at. The nurses and doctors advised reporting the incident to the police, clearly displeased with the situation. I agreed and stepped out to call Frank. He answered and informed me that the police had arrived and were currently taking statements. The call was then handed over to the police officer, who expressed a desire to hear the full story later, to which I agreed. According to Frank, Sherry was just sitting on the floor, unresponsive to anyone or anything. After hanging up, I returned to George's hospital room, received instructions for his hospital stay, and decided to go home to gather some essentials. When I arrived back home, there was a crowd gathered around, making it difficult to get inside. Finally, inside, Sherry immediately started to lash out. "Why wasn't it you? Why did George go into that room? If you had gone in, none of this would have happened to George." Breaking free from the police officer's restraint, Sherry lunged at me. "It should have been you. You're already old. If you had fallen, this house and this land would have been mine." Despite efforts from Frank and the police, Sherry continued spewing hateful words with a ferocity that felt like she could physically harm me. She was eventually pulled away and arrested. Suddenly silent, as if a switch had been flipped, she was escorted out of the house by the police, drawing the attention of many onlookers. Left behind, Frank and I stood there stunned, watching the whole sequence of events unfold. We were snapped back to reality by the police officer. I briefly answered their questions and then headed back to the hospital with the essentials George needed. When I arrived at his hospital room, no nurses or doctors were around. Upon hearing about the situation at home, George, who had momentarily forgotten about his severe injuries, started to make a commotion. A nurse rushed in, and together we managed to calm him down. "I've been suspicious of her for a while," George began. "The way she sometimes looks at Mom bothers me. I've been meaning to say something." Despite his words, I had never sensed any such concern from George before, nor did it seem like he had noticed anything alarming. He always avoided getting involved in troublesome matters. This time seemed no different. Utterly exasperated, George continued, "Hey, Mom, I've been thinking for a while now." His voice lowered, and I asked him curiously what was on his mind. "I'm thinking of breaking up with Sherry," George confessed. His sudden revelation surprised me, but given everything that had happened, it didn't seem unreasonable. "I don't know how Sherry acts when it's just her and me, but her behavior during visits has been terrible. She acts as if she's entitled to special treatment, refuses to help out, and throws tantrums if things don't go her way," George explained. "We've never liked her, but we never thought about forcing me to divorce her. We've never been fans of her behavior, that's for sure, but that doesn't mean we ever considered pushing me to divorce her. We never asked you or Frank about Sherry, and it felt wrong to even consider it. After all, I'm an adult and it's not your place to meddle in my marriage," George said. "Frank and I have even talked about staying out of it if George doesn't say anything. But now George is coming to us for advice on divorce." I was at a loss for words. Mom, she's always been so harsh with you, and she's been rude to Dad too. I can't take it anymore, George exclaimed. It was then that I felt something was off. Sure, Sherry had never hidden her disdain for me, she didn't even try. I assumed she acted the same way when it was just her and George. However, she was indifferent to Frank. Frank is a gentle soul, but not much of a talker. He has a stern face, which is probably why I rarely saw them talking since they got married. So it felt odd when she got flustered after Frank asked about the golf ball incident. She usually gave cold replies, but this time she raised her voice. Do I have to pay alimony if we divorce? And there are hospital bills too. Can you help, Mom? George asked suddenly. That's when it clicked. George had been trying to butter me up for this very reason. It's heartbreaking, but George is my flesh and blood. I can read his expressions and gestures. I know what he's thinking. I've always found him adorable and couldn't help but meddle. But ever since he hit puberty, he's found it annoying. Like Sherry, George also resents us, but he's playing the good son for the sake of money. Hey George, what happened to the money for the car you said you were going to replace the other day? I recalled. When our son and his wife were visiting, he mentioned getting a new car and needing some financial help because it was pricey. Obviously, if he mentioned this in front of Frank, he'd be met with opposition, so he discreetly came to me. I couldn't refuse my dear George, so I gave him the full amount. However, the car he drove home in was the same one he had before. So you haven't bought it yet? If that's the case, you can use that money for the hospital bills. It might not cover alimony, but it'll help. But then, what about the car? You can save up again once you're better. We all have our own lives, you know. You're old enough to figure things out yourself, I said, feeling frustrated. I was dumbfounded that George still expected financial help from us at this point. After saying my piece, I left the hospital. Truthfully, I knew George had been squandering the money I gave him. Sherry had informed me, though she was clearly benefiting from it too. I've always worried and intervened in his affairs, but it seems it has backfired. I saw this as an opportunity to confide in Frank. After hearing me out, Frank disclosed, I've been meaning to talk to you about this. He revealed he had recently lost his job and was in considerable debt. This revelation shocked me, especially since they had discussed it while out shopping. At that point, there was nothing more to say to George. Frank and I made the decision to disown him. Some time has passed since then. Sherry is now in prison after being convicted, and it appears she initiated the divorce from George before the trial began. Later, I heard it was because George had started withholding money from her until he stopped altogether. This revelation left me horrified, especially knowing what she did in my room, hoping it would bring her more money. As for George, he seemed to embrace the idea of divorce when Sherry suggested it, ultimately agreeing. He isn't burdened much by alimony, but is drowning in the debt he created. Of course, the money for the car had long been squandered. We covered his hospital bills, but he's diligently working to pay off his other debts. It's a pathetic situation, but it's the consequence of his lifelong dependency. I hope he learns from this. As for Frank and me, the money we had been giving George actually came from Frank. I didn't have that kind of money, but Frank loved George and wanted to support him through me. Now, that's no longer an option. We're planning a hot spring trip, something we've never done before. I do regret putting George through all this, but given everything, it can't be helped. Now, the happiest moments are when Frank and I are looking at travel magazines together.